Okay, Civil Power. This was, again, a review copy from a series of games that I kind of agreed to try to give some exposure to. Unfortunately, I probably shouldn't have chosen this one. It's not really my type of taste in terms of games. That was more of a flaw in me doing or failing to do any kind of research before I agreed. I was like, I know Brian Train. I wanted to look into it, and I selected 4 things that I thought at least vaguely kind of touched into my interests on this. This is a tactical representation of street combat between police and mobs. And, my initial thought was, okay, I'll push through a couple of scenarios of it. I couldn't make it through even the first one that I chose to do. And some of that is a lack of excitement because it really is just the combat in the streets. I thought, I don't know why, because there were agitators mentioned in it and whatnot in the description for it, that there would be more going on than just straight out fighting. There really isn't. It's a pure combat game. Component-wise, I found the counters somewhat lackluster. Again, printing is going to change on these, so that might get improved. I had a little bit of difficulty determining what was what, but there are player aids, and one of the player aids, although it doesn't, the rules don't really tell you this, but one of the player aids expresses a way to determine what each unit is, which was perfectly workable. It just took me a little bit of effort, more than I usually have. The player aids are decent quality, a thin stock, but they're fine. And they give you a number of pieces of information. The combat charts, let's see, what else? Terrain effects, etc. This is the main one you'll be playing with. The unit card, which I showed you, one with the game turn, sequence of play, very helpful in general, and then a list of what things are worth victory points. In general, not every scenario works that way. The scenario that I played may or may not have intended to use the base victory points. When I looked at other scenarios, some of them said do not use standard victory points. This one didn't say that, but it felt like it probably should have. Doesn't really make a difference. I got 4 maps, but 2 of them are the same in each case, so maybe somebody got no maps, I don't know. Again, the printer has been an issue with the producer. The problem with the maps, they're thin, floppy, whatever, that I found with playing was that the spaces are not big enough. It's not a big deal where there's no buildings involved, but where there are buildings involved, these spaces are kind of obnoxious. And I had stacks that were just unwieldy for the size of the spaces. You really kind of need to be able to put multiple stacks in a given space when you're handling the shock combat. And when you're in buildings, some people are on the upper floor, some people are on the lower floor. I had some question about buildings. Maybe I can answer it now when it's too late. So, yeah, Yeah, see, they say stairways are up and down are assumed to be in each area. I get the feeling I played it correctly, which is that each square on the map is a space, and the buildings just aren't divided for graphical reasons more than anything else. And what that means is if you're in a specific space in a building, there's people on the upper floor, people on the lower floor. There could be, probably not in this case, but there could be multiple stacks on at least one of those two floors where one person's attacking and the other person's in there already. And then you kind of want to also segment out the suppressed units, because maybe you want to keep track of a little bit more. So the maps the spaces on the maps are a little too small. Well, they're a lot too small for that kind of sorting, for the kind of crowding that I was seeing in some of the spaces. All of that would be livable. What really turned out not to be pleasant was fire combat doesn't do a whole hell of a lot. Your chances, you end up, as I played, I began to get better and better at, what is the tactical mechanism? What do you use in this game to do things? And really what it came down to was you use the combat results tables on the fire table just to force the enemy to make a morale check to suppress them so they can't do anything, especially with the police who have good shock combat capabilities. Then you move police in to do the shock combat. But the problem with the shock combat is with all the combat, honestly, everything is kind of a roll to hit. You get a result. The fire combat might end up with kills or woundings, which aren't good for you. You don't want them to happen, but you kind of need them to get the bonuses high enough that you might cause a real failure on the morale check where the unit dissipates. Shock combat's a lot better at causing units to dissipate. But what it kind of means is you just want to put suppressing fire out and, delay the enemy from being able to do anything. In the scenario that I played, and this would apply to most of the scenarios, I guess, the mob kind of just wants to keep the police from doing anything and delay the game as long as possible, maybe get a couple of kills if they can off of lucky shots and whatnot. But suppressed units under fire attack don't suffer a morale issue. The only thing that can dissipate a unit or disintegrate a unit or whatever is to get kills and wounds against it, which in effect could actually hurt you more than they help you. Because the points that you get back for the points you get back for destroying a unit, removing it from the board through combat, without killing or wounding people, are offset by whatever kills and wounds you get against that group. You're also, a group of police is some unknown number of them. So it can absorb many, many kills and woundings. A single figure, a kill or a wound takes it out of play, which makes it somewhat better in terms of that. But what really ruined it for me was when it came down to the shock combat and you start rolling and you have very little chance of affecting each other and you're both standing there just sort of throwing, pushing each other or something until somebody either gives up and runs away, but that might not be possible, or they end up dissipating eventually. And it's a very, very cumbersome process and just painful to me. There aren't a lot of different systems in here. Movement is relatively slow, especially once you start slogging into buildings and whatnot. Stacking was fine, whatever. Too many for the spaces, but that's okay. I didn't play anything with crowd units. Crowd units would give the mob, I guess, a little bit more oomph in terms of being able to do real violence on the enemy with shock combat. I take a look at some of the crowds, an untrained crowd, a trained crowd, they have like 4 or 6 shock combat, which is about as good as the police have. So a crowd can actually get kills off that shock combat table. The shock combat table was really only available to the police, except when it's not. Sometimes there's an opportunity that might be worthwhile to take advantage of. Um, all kinds of funky weapons and such not that are available through the various scenarios. You might have different options: gas, rubber bullets, up to like tanks for the Warsaw scenario, and maybe some of the ones against Israel or whatever, or the Israelis against the Palestinians. Gas guns. In the end, it's hard to tell which hit me worse. So like, I play with great misery games that have saving throw type situations in them, and the one that comes to mind the most for me on this is La Grande Guerre, in terms of, hey, I love that game, but in the naval combat, which I absolutely abhor, but have to play out, and I get my certain enjoyment out of it because it's ships, man. It's exciting. Ships lobbing shells at each other is kind of exciting, and it also works a little faster. There is sort of this: I fire, oh, did it? I get a hit, and then you make a check on the defense against it to see, did it actually do damage. This has something similar to that. I get a hit, and what it really comes down to is the only way that you score victory points in this game off of dissipating units is, did it fail its morale check with above a 6? What that means is that all units, once they're, I don't know, all units have an equal chance of completely dissipating. Their morale has no effect on that. The only thing the morale level actually affects is whether or not they'll go into cowering mode, into suppression, at which point they have basically no shock combat value anymore. Yet they still roll on the table, so you can have two stacks with 0 shock combat fighting each other, and that happened a couple of times in my game. That's a really ugly situation. You need a 4 or higher to have any chance of a morale check on them. Now here, the suppression gives a penalty to the unit. So if you've already got the enemy suppressed, those units might dissipate on a roll of a 6. And there's also a possibility of getting a retreat value, which could increase the chances of a morale failure. But yeah, just when you have 2 units like that, well, if they're inside a building, they already have a -2 to the combat roll for the shock combat. So you could have 2 stacks of units which can only harm each other on a 6. And if they roll a 6, then they need a second 6 to destroy the unit. So basically you're looking at a 1 in 36 chance, but it's on a per unit basis, so you might weaken them. Well, you might dissipate some units before, with greater odds than 1 in 36 for each die roll. But it could take a long time to roll out a single shock combat. Fire combats are a little bit easier, but I found the clutter on the board, the suppressed units, having to keep track of when they can unsuppress, etc., all having to do with that clutter, the too many counters in one little space, causing me problems. I found myself in a couple of places where I had to kind of make decisions based on the game, but none of that really bothers me. The two things that really highlight it for me are, one, the topic. I'm not into, this skirmish type of combat, where everything's kind of chaotic and people are just, taking pot shots here and there and maybe mobbing for a melee or whatever, without formed units and whatnot. It's why I stay away from, 20th century modern combat games for the most part, the squad leader and stuff like that. And if something like that appeals to you, well, then this immediately becomes more interesting. But can you deal with that plinking away where it might be the best move for both players to stay in a space, or it might be the only move for one player and the other person, it's their best move, to stay in one space and just, basically hide behind furniture and taunt each other until somebody passes out. I don't even know, what is happening there. I'm trying to come up with something because there's no chance of anybody getting hurt, wounded, or killed. All there is that the entire unit just vaporizes. Now, what you might have, and what I had, was people on the second floor, and maybe I was stupid or something, but it's what happened in my game. People on the second floor, the mob units on the second floor, who had good firepower but no melee capability, all got suppressed. Some cops came up, started bashing heads. That's fine so far. Still too tedious and too cumbersome for my taste, but okay. And then the cop got suppressed. Now the cop could have left, but basically they both stood there, and if the cop fails a morale check, they probably are okay. To be honest, both sides are about equal at that point, so the cops probably should have withdrawn. But the big bonus, well, no, because the big bonus is that the units were already suppressed, but in a building. So there's only a -1 to the die roll. So the defending mob on a 6 would get a retreat result, which increases their chance of actually surrendering. First of all, they have twice as many chances of rolling, right? No, both would get a morale check on a 5 or a 6. But the mob, because they were blocked by further police on the bottom level, had a 2 in 6 chance of dissipating on any successful morale check. Well, not on half the successful morale checks, but whatever. Anyway, part of the mechanism is to get some cops. If you can trap the mob up on, the mob forces up on the second floor and move cops up to melee them and get other cops below them, you can prevent them from having any retreat, any exit, and then you get a better chance of destroying them. But it ended up just a situation where neither side could actually do any harm to the other. They weren't actually even in a fist fight or anything, as far as I could tell. I don't know. I mean, everybody was cowering, basically. And I guess the mob would just eventually surrender, or some of the police surrender to each other. And I mean, I had situations where I think police units were destroyed up on that second floor, and some of the mob were. And I don't know, do you really see the police running away down the stairs or surrendering or what? I have no idea what's going on there. And trying to do some hand-waving explanation of it all didn't really work. I could have taken that as a laughable situation where I'm like, well, that's fucking ridiculous, but still had fun. I have fun with like Awful Green Things is one example of something where silly shit happens, and it came up earlier in the playthrough, that feels kind of like this, sort of. But there's just, I don't know. At least with that game, it usually it doesn't break down to a couple of pieces just fighting forever or for several rounds of combat, because within the course of a turn you could fight several rounds before one side or the other is completely dissipated or withdraws or anything like that. And it was becoming way too tedious for whatever fun I might have possibly gotten out of this. Could there be some tweaks to it? I don't know, because I understand what's being tried, what's being attempted with this, which is to make it so that combat is relatively nonviolent. It's a pushing people around, and maybe there are scenarios that would have worked better. Maybe I chose a bad scenario and I just don't want to deal with, anything else. But I look at most of them, and while some of them have a time limit on the number of turns that you go through, and that would help. This one did not. Some of them have a time limit on the number of turns you go through. Still, there's nothing that guarantees that any given combat won't go forever, except for luck itself. But, when you're looking at 1 in 36s, if you're looking at two suppressed units trying to batter each other, you're looking at a 1 in 36 chance on one side and maybe a little bit more than that on the other of dissipating units. And one side can't retreat and the other side doesn't want to. Well, boy, that's painful. How likely is that? Well, honestly, the situation that arose from that came from me playing it more and getting more of an idea of how to get a successful attack on something, as opposed to just racking up wounds and kills against the enemy, which actually hurt you because, bad press because cops killed 3 protesters, or, wow, those mob are a bunch of thugs. They broke a cop's leg, and take a look at the Capitol riot where several police were badly injured. That did not go well. For the rioters and insurrectionists as a whole. Anyhow, I can't recommend this. But if it's a topic that really interests you, yeah, it might be worth picking up for the exploration value. You might be able to tweak around with it a little bit. But what it really needs is a system to resolve the combats so that an outcome occurs relatively quickly in a given shock combat. And there's just too much room in this game for a shock combat to go on for too long. One thing that I noted with it was that the format it comes in is just, first of all, there's the argument of, well, the map isn't big enough. But then there's the other side of it of, if you were going to make a game that's sort of this small, I would want it to be something that essentially folds up and goes into the little plastic box like the old Steve Jackson games, and TSR also did some that were similar to that. With a map, instead of the map being a solid sheet of stock, something that folds up. Now that's not something that's possible on this print-on-demand type model, but something like this would get a little bit more love for me if it could just slip into my coat pocket and go to a coffee house. Not a lot. I've got others. I'm thinking the Ogre. Well, Ogre, among others, but also Battlesuit from that same universe, which, you know, had this Poochie map and everything. And it just, I don't know if I ever even played it. Well, at least Ogre, I brought a couple of places and played a few times. But again, yeah, too close to that tactical fighting without anything interesting happening for me. Anyhow, yeah, I kind of regret taking these on because I don't like I don't like playing things that I dislike, and I certainly don't like, you know, having to give a lousy view on something. But yeah, this just didn't do it for me, I'm afraid. All right, up it goes. Ugh.